Okay, I've got 1:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. This is your host, Jennifer Brennan. I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the Encore presentation for Part 1 of the Environmental Data Management Best Practices NASA Earth Data webinar. Today's webinar will focus on best practices for tabular data and is a repeat of the webinar that was held on the 10th. Okay. While everybody's logging in, there are a couple of polls at the bottom of the page we'd like for you to answer. If you could take a second. Note that there's not a submit button for the multiple choice and multiple answer polls, so once you select your answer, your vote has been registered. I am the User Support and Communications Lead for the NASA Earth Science Data and Information System, or ESDIS project here at Goddard Space Flight Center. I do want to start by going over a couple of housekeeping items that are related to the webinar. Excuse me. So we're broadcasting audio by way of both the computer as well as telecom. If you're listening in through the phone, be sure to mute or turn off your computer speakers. And for those with built-in computer speakers, there's a speaker icon at the bottom right-hand corner of the desktop menu, of the desktop in your menu bar for PCs. And if you left-click, you should be able to mute, and that'll help, for feedback. I have placed this conference in silent mode, so the speaker will not be able to hear you. So if you have any issues or any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat pod, which is in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. The Q&A pod, it works like a chat. This particular pod will be persistent throughout the webinar itself. So if you have any issues or any questions, please be sure to type them in to the Q&A pod as we go through the webinar. The webinar will be recorded. A link to the recording will be sent out to registrants as well as those who were unable to participate today. They will also be posted to our Earth Data Adobe Connect catalog link, which is the tinyurl.earthdatawebinar.com. And, it's tinyurl.com/earthdatawebinar, and I will provide that to you at the end of the webinar, okay? You will also be able to download all presentation files as well as the agenda. And contact information, so not to worry, all that information will be posted. If you don't get to it at the end of the webinar, it will be posted to the tinyurl site, and I'll send that out to everybody. The webinar is an hour long. Today, 50 minutes are allocated to the presentation content and then 10 minutes for questions. I will extend the question and answer period for another 15 minutes if need be. After the speakers have finished their presentations, however, we'll then move to the polling questions. So be sure to stay on the line if you're interested in participating in the question and answer period, okay? One thing to note, for those of you who are participating in both Part 1 and Part 2 today, you will be logged out of the room, or go ahead and log out for Part 1 and then log back in using the specific URL that's assigned to Part 2. This helps us keep track of the two separate webinars, even though they are back-to-back, and I realize that's a little bit of an inconvenience, but it really helps us keep track of all the questions and answers and will allow us to post two separate recordings for everybody. It will allow us to know who the participants are for both. Okay. As mentioned a bit earlier, you will have an opportunity to ask your questions throughout. We will plan, however, to answer all the questions verbally at the end of the webinar. Due to the size of this webinar, we will not answer questions using the raising hand function, so I have disabled that. I'd like to now move on to the agenda. All right. So the agenda today, the first 5 minutes or so will provide you with an overview of the NASA Oak Ridge National Laboratory Distributed Active Archive Center. We will then move directly to Part 1, Best Practices, again, which will focus on tabular data. I'd like to turn it over now to our first speaker, Suresh Vanan, who is the Oak Ridge National Laboratory DAAC Manager. Suresh?
Thank you, Jennifer. So for the next 5 minutes or so, I'm just going to introduce you to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory Distributed Active Archive Center and step through a couple of slides, in terms of why we need these best practices for tabular data. So just to introduce myself, I am Suresh Vannan, the Oak Ridge DAAC manager. My background is in GIS and remote sensing, and I've been doing remote sensing related work for the last 15 years or so. So about the ORNL DAAC, the ORNL DAAC is one of the data centers within the NASA USDIS framework of data centers. There are about 12 data centers within NASA handling terrestrial data sets and data sets from NASA's Earth observing system of satellites. The Oak Ridge DAAC primarily archives data from the NASA's Terrestrial Ecology Program, which is in support of the NASA's Carbon Cycle and Ecosystems focus area. So as the slide shows, we have 4 types of data products archived at the ORNL DAAC. I'll step through each one of those. The first one is field campaign data. So these are data sets provided from NASA's field campaign. So every few years there is an intensive campaign funded by NASA. Just to give you a few examples, back in 2000, there was the Safari 2000 campaign in Southern Africa. Just recently, we've been archiving data from the Amazon on a project called LBA. And in the future, we will be archiving data from North America as part of the NACP campaign. The model code archives all the source code of model information. And then we also have regional and global data and land validation. The URL provided on the slide should give you more information about each of these data products. So this is really the meat of the discussion here. Why do we need to have these best practices? And I've listed here 3 reasons. The first reason is we're spending a lot of research investments in collecting data, and we want to make sure that we protect those research investments by making sure that the data is well documented and available to other researchers interested in using the data. As with several observational data, which gets stored in tabular format, we cannot collect them again. The space and time at which the data was collected cannot be repeated. So it is in our best interest to make sure that we archive those appropriately. And then from a data center perspective, we want to make sure that we give good credit to the data providers. A recent trend is that a lot of the journals are requiring publishers, a lot of people who create manuscripts to publish the data sets before they accept a manuscript. So that's an interesting trend which is catching on with several journal publications. And then in terms of resources, the URL listed provides detailed information about data management principles. We walk you through data from the perspective of planning for a data collection exercise to managing the data and archival and all the steps that's needed for curation of a data set. So this website has a lot of rich information. Many of those will be discussed over the course of the webinar with some examples. But it should give you several examples, both with tabular data and with geospatial data sets as well. So this is a good resource to look into. And of course, our examples are tied to some of the NASA terrestrial ecology data sets, but you might find this useful for any other data products that you may deal with. So I'll hand this over to Jennifer right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Suresh. Our next speaker is Dr. Bob Cook, the Chief Scientist at the Oak Ridge DAAC. Bob?
Thanks very much, Jennifer. I want to welcome everyone to our webinar today on tabular data. I've called it Best Practices for Preparing Data for Sharing and Archiving. Before I begin, I just want to say a few words about myself. I'm a scientist by training, a biogeochemist. I'm involved in a number of science projects. Recently, I've been heavily involved in the North American Carbon Program, and I'm also involved in an NSF project that deals with data distribution. It's called Data One. But the approach that I have for looking at data management is really that of a scientist. What can a scientist do to improve their data management? And also, importantly, what can the ORNL DAAC do to make it easier for scientists to both submit data to the archive as well as retrieve data from the archive? So what I'm going to talk today about, I'll give you a real brief introduction about data management. I'll talk for a little bit about metadata, a really important concept for best practices for data management. And then I'll get into the rest of the talk will be discussing some fundamental best practices that we feel are very important. So I think it's always good to step back and look at the benefits of good data management practices. I think in the short term, if you do the practices that we talk about today in both this first seminar and webinar and the second, I think you'll spend less time doing data management and more time doing research. These best practices we're going to talk about will help you develop really good data sets, data files. So when you put them down and then pick them up maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks later, maybe a few months later, you won't have to remind yourself about what you did. It'll be really clear exactly what you have in those files, and you can begin to use them right away. So it's going to be easier for you to use those data files. And I think importantly, too, any collaborators you have for your projects can readily understand and use the files. You can just turn it over to a collaborator, be it at the same institution or other collaborators around the world, really, and they can just look at your files, understand what you have there, and begin using them. So you don't have to spend any time telling them this means that, and over here this means something different. So that's in the short term. Over the long term, we like to think of publishing our data in an archive so that it can be made available to the general public, and that benefits scientists really outside your projects because they can come in and discover your data and use it to address broad questions, maybe some questions that you had never thought about initially. So making them available has some real benefit. And you get credit for that. We have ways of citing data, giving credit to the original investigators so that they get credit much like they get credit for publishing a paper. And then the most important thing, and really what's driving a lot of this, particularly in the United States, is that the sponsors, the funders of these activities protect their investment in your research. As Suresh said, a lot of times the research cannot be reproduced. It's from observations last year, and those observations of environmental conditions can't be reproduced. And so it's important to have a record of that so that then in the future we can analyze that record without having to go back and try to either reconstruct it or actually remeasure those observations. I'm going to spend about 5 slides on metadata because it is really an important concept for data management. And metadata is really information to find, understand, and use the data. It can be in the form of descriptors, standard keywords, information such as time and place that are in a standardized format. It could also be in human readable documentation, and that's very useful just for somebody to come in and look at this metadata record in a document and read the text that describes the data set. More commonly, we can think of metadata as the answers to these questions. The who collected the data, who processed the data, the where were the data collected, where were the data processed, These are just really fundamental things. I think when you're compiling data, you know all this, but you need to let others know the answers to these questions. When were the data collected? What are the data about? What project were they collected under? What are the constraints on their use, if any? And then how were the data collected? How were they processed? How do I access the data? And probably the most important question, why were the data collected? Just to give the user, future user of these data, an idea about what exactly the data set contains. So these are really fundamental questions that make up the metadata. Pretty easy to compile, but very important. I want to give you a real life example. This is a picture on the right. It's a Northern Lights Aurora Borealis with a comet going through, and the metadata for it is simply Aurora with comet. That's certainly true, but it's rather incomplete. I think you can all imagine what's missing from that information, from that metadata about that particular picture. One thing for sure is where was that picture taken? Another is when was that picture taken? You might want to know the direction the camera lens was pointing. Also, you might want to know what that comet is. It just says that it is a comet, and there's no further description. But in order to make a complete metadata record, you might want to say what the comet was. In this case, it was a Hale-Bopp comet with the Aurora Borealis in the background. We like to think of having our metadata conform to this 20-year rule. And we like to think that the metadata written today will be understandable by someone 20 years from now, that they don't need you to stand there and interpret the data file or the metadata record to say exactly what was done. To be honest, 20 years from now, you're probably going to be on to some other activity, and who knows what that is, and you're probably not going to want to sit down and think about this old project, and you're probably not going to remember it even if you were willing to sit down and discuss it. So what you need to do today is compile this information for this user 20 years from now. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what does that investigator 20 years from now need to know in order to use the data. So a fundamental rule here is that you prepare the data and documentation for a user who's really unfamiliar with your projects, methods, and observations. Write it in a general enough way so that they could just pick it up and not have to have you right there to help them interpret the data. This diagram also illustrates the metadata required to understand the data. And this is the kind of metadata that would be required if you had, say, a professor and a grad student and maybe a postdoc, and you were studying stream water flow from a watershed and looking at nutrient flow in that stream. And you might take a sample at a particular weir. You may analyze that sample in the lab down the hall using a nutrient analyzer of some sort. But the three of you know exactly what the instrument does, how the instrument operates, what the units are. And so the metadata you guys need, that small group needs, is pretty limited. But once you have that, you could probably run with it. But that's not going to be useful in 20 years. And it's certainly not going to be useful if you wanted to take your data and combine it with, say, other watershed scientists in the studying that watershed, or other scientists from around the world who are studying similar watersheds of interest. Clearly, they're going to need more information. And I want to just use this diagram to show the kinds of information that are going to be important to include. I'm going to use this little green arrow. I hope you can all see it. But that arrow right now is pointing to the geographic coordinates. It's not very useful to say that you collected the water samples at the weir. You really need to say that the geographic coordinates, so somebody can map that in relation to the watershed, in relation to other streams elsewhere in the world. You might want to also know the the elevation of that particular stream location. You want to know the method, and you want to know exactly what the method was measuring, what the units are. You also want to know what the detection limit is for that to make sure that it's sensitive enough to be looking at find variations in nutrient content, maybe what the accuracy is. You need a really good definition of the parameter and the units, information about the quality quality assurance tests that were made. All of this metadata is very important. It looks like it might be difficult to compile, but I think everyone knows in their studies, they know all this information. And what we need to do is just compile that in a way so that others can find and understand the information that you know. So this slide is a summary of the basic principles for data management that we'll talk about for the remainder of this webinar. It is really, as you'll look down through the list, it's pretty fundamental things that you could do, almost habits that you could do every time you go into the field or into the lab, important things that you need to do. And we're just going to step through those. The very first one is to define the contents of your data files. As you're planning your study, maybe you've written a proposal or maybe for a funding agency, or maybe you've written a proposal for a dissertation or a thesis. You have a hypothesis and you have the measurements you're going to make to test that hypothesis. At that point, you should start thinking about the data files that you're going to need to hold all this information. What is it you're going to measure? What are the important things that need ancillary information that need to be included? And our rule for this is that you want to keep a set of similar measurements together in one file, maybe information from the same investigator, maybe the same methods. If you're studying one thing at many locations, you might want to just keep all of that information in one file. Say for the example of the watershed I used earlier, say you're working on a team and one group is measuring atmospheric chemistry. They're looking at deposition of nutrients, rainfall, temperature, conditions of that sort. Another group is looking at stream nutrient values, and a third group is looking, say, at soil moisture, maybe the movement of nutrients through the soil. Well, those are different enough types of measurements that you probably want to put those each in their own file and compile them that way. Each and every situation is unique, and we don't have any hard and fast rules about the contents of each file, but we want folks to think about making it simple for both you, the data producer, as well as the data user, so you have the really good, well-structured files that can be useful for others. We want you to define the parameters, our next best practice. I like this table here as a parameter table. It shows the short names in that very first column, has a description of, rather detailed description of exactly what is meant by each of the different short names. And then most importantly, the units and the format. This is a study from Southern Africa that's archived at the ORNL DAAC. And you can see pretty plainly what everything is and what the units are. As far as the units you should use and maybe the names of parameters that you should use, we recommend that you go to your community and see what they're using. Maybe look in archives that your community deposits their data in. Maybe look in papers and use those parameter names and units so that your data sets are similar to theirs and make it easier for people to understand them. The most important thing really is to be consistent and to explicitly state what the units are. Furthermore, we suggest that folks choose a format for each parameter, explain that format, exactly what it is in the metadata, and then use that format throughout. And I have a couple of examples here, and you can see those. We have a certain format for date. I really like this format because where you start with the year, then month and day numerically, because it sorts in nicely in a file. We suggest that you use local time and in particular local standard time. We suggest that you do not use daylight savings time. and that you also think about maybe having 2 times in there, maybe one being the local time and one the coordinated universal time, so that people know exactly when the measurements were made. We also suggest that you use a code for missing values if for some reason you don't have a value for a particular observation, that you let people know that it's missing, so they don't have to wonder if it was deleted by mistake or something else. This is a document here, this last bullet. The Hook et al. Document is really a nice summary of data management best practices that we suggest you take a look at. The next best practice is to use a consistent data organization, and again, we don't have any real hard and fast rules. I'm going to show a couple of examples. This very first example is more like a spreadsheet where each row in a file represents a complete record. In this case, it's you can see the header file. First row contains the variable name, the short name, and then the next row contains the units, very clearly labeled so you know what's there. In this kind of a format, if you wanted to add another variable like maybe relative humidity or wind speed, you'd simply add another column off to the right and continue the collecting information in that manner. This is a format that's more like a spreadsheet, and we call it a wide format for a data file. This other equally good approach for doing it is more like a relational database, in which case the parameter name and the value and the units are all placed in individual rows. So each row contains a measurement, an observation, but it could be very different ones. In this case, rows 2 and 3 contain temperature, and 3 and 4 contain precipitation. So in this way, if you wanted to make a measurement of relative humidity or wind speed, you'd add a row. And so this is a table that will become long and skinny, and as I mentioned, it's the format that people will use for relational databases. The key thing here is to be consistent in your file and in organizing it and formatting it. Don't change or rearrange the columns of the rows. Include a header row so that people know exactly what's there, and include both the variable name and the units in those first couple of header rows. I want to show you this example. It's from a colleague at NCEAS, and it's kind of an embarrassing example, but it's a really good one. It's a bad example. I just showed you some of the thoughts that we have about what should be included. This is an example in which there's this information off on the side, shore and average concentration. Don't know what those are, don't know what they pertain to, don't know what the units are. They're off on the side, kind of odd looking. We also have this column here with C's in it. That's an unlabeled column. We really don't know what that is. And then there's another couple values in this bottommost row. They're in a column with %C and again with %N, but who knows what they are in terms of samples and things. They could be an average maybe or something. So there's a lot of questions with this. Another thing with this example is that the colors are there. Not really sure exactly what all those colors mean. Maybe it's key to the reference. The important thing to note, though, is that if you're using R or MATLAB or some other programming language to analyze these, those programming languages typically won't be able to recognize the colors and won't be able to understand how to deal with those. The amazing thing about this is, and some of you have maybe already seen it, it says, don't use old data, which is not a very good thing to see in your file. But there's no indication of what file to go to actually use the data. So this is an example of poor data practices, and this is an example of a good one where we've got our header rows. The first row is the parameter, and the second is the units. And you can see it goes through. These are data, again, from Southern Africa, from a site in western Zambia, the Mongu Flux Tower site. and there's information about the date using our format of year and then month. And then there's information about, carbon and nitrogen and their stable isotopes. And also notice, too, that there's some information here. There's some missing values where for some reason the value is missing and the -999 was in there. But this is an example of what your data files should look like when you generate them for tabular data. The next best practice is to use stable file formats. And I like to pull up this old, no, it's not too old, it's about 6-year-old item from the BBC News, where the director of the National Archives in the UK is worried about this data ticking time bomb, where they have all these old files in their holdings, but they're not able to read those files because they're in a format that's no longer readable by today's machines. And so there's a threat there that if you're not really careful in how to use stable file formats, you may lose the information. So we recommend that you avoid proprietary formats, things like Lotus 123 for those who remember of the old days, or even Excel 1. Excel 1 is no longer readable by the modern Excel. So you avoid those proprietary formats because they may not be readable into the future. So we recommend text files, formats for tabular data, things like this comma-separated values format in which all the information is present there as ASCII encoded, and there's comma separating each of the parameters in the first 2 header rows, the parameters and then the units, and then each of the values down below are separated by a comma. And you can look at this, and we feel that this format will be readable on into the future. From an archive standpoint, we really don't want to have to go in and reformat all of our data files. We just like to do it once and make sure they're accessible on into the future. For tabular, that was for tabular data. Now for geospatial file formats, we suggest the following for raster data, gridded data. GeoTIFFs has become very popular. NetCDF is very popular with modelers. For remote sensing folks, HDF is popular. And then also there's an ASCII format that's in a ASCII grid that allows people to place all the raster values into this ASCII format and then be able to map them. Yeah, Shane will talk more about this in part 2 on geospatial data and show some examples of all these different types. For vector data, we recommend shapefiles or else the Google KML file for formatting those. We feel that those will be readable on into the future, which is really important. The next best practice is to assign descriptive file names. In this example here, we have a project here at the DAAC called Bigfoot, and that's the project name. The next information in this file name is the site where the measurements were made. In this case, it's Agro, which is an agricultural site in Illinois. The year, and then what was measured is gross primary productivity, and the file format is a TIFF. It's a GeoTIFF, so it's a spatial data. But this is an example of a descriptive file name. There's clearly more information you need to understand that. But it's a file name that would allow you to go into your hard drive and find, when you see this file, you'll be able to understand what's in it, and you'll likely be able to find it readily. I think our hard drives are so big anymore on our PCs and our laptops that you need good file names and good organization in order to be able to find your files. So the rules we have here, that the file name should be unique, they should reflect the contents, and you should avoid spaces and special characters. A lot of your data files will end up on servers, web servers that don't handle spaces very well. Also have a couple of examples of bad data files, and we see these all the time, and they're just not very descriptive, and if you have a lot of projects over a period of time, you're going to have a lot of mydata.xls file formats. You won't be able to file names, and you won't be able to tell what's in those. So if you've done this really well, you should be able to find and understand your files. You should also be able to have your file names tell a story, and this is a comic from PhD Comics showing it's a graduate student who is making some studies on May 28, 2010, starting out in the afternoon. I can't get the green arrow to work, so I can't point to these. But anyway, you can see as they go down and through the evening, they're having some trouble. Thanks very much. Having some trouble. Things start out well, but then get into trouble and have some really tough times. About 2:40, 3:22 in the morning, they're really having a bad time, and then all of a sudden they have an epiphany at 4:16. Something goes right, getting not bad, and then some use this one, analysis and graphs, thesis outline. They move on to notes for a meeting with Professor Smith, and evidently it didn't go so well because they're starting over their PhD research. But this is a nice way to name your files, so you can look at them and tell exactly what was in there, and an important aspect of data management in today's ability to have a lot of data files. So the next part of that, maybe a corollary to that, is once you have all these files, you really need to organize them logically. You need to make sure that you have a good structure for your directories for your files, so that you can they're well organized, so you can go right in and find them. In this case, we're looking at a biodiversity study that took place in grasslands and lakes, and it was both observational fieldwork and as well as experiments. So there's a real distinction between all those, and you can go into the experiments and see that there's a heat experiment and a predator experiment, maybe some sort of a zooplankton, plankton sort of a experiment, and then the fieldwork, the measurements, so we're looking at plankton and chlorophyll profiles. So they're really well-defined file names as well as a good structure for the data files to find them. The next best practice is to preserve information, and especially to preserve processing information. On the left-hand side is a data file. What we recommend really is to keep your raw data raw. We recommend that you make your raw data files read-only. So once you place all of the information in there that you're satisfied with, that you cannot accidentally make a change to that. With some graphical spreadsheet software, you can be clicking around in it and accidentally hit a key and delete an entry, and there's no recovery of that entry. So if you have all of your files be read-only, then you can do your processing by taking all the contents of that and doing it in another location, and that's just a whole lot safer. We also suggest that you use a programming language to do all of your processing, and there's a lot of advantages to that. Some of the examples of the programming languages are R, and that's become extremely popular with in statistical analysis, particularly for undergraduate classes and graduate students, and we see a lot of folks using that. MATLAB is another. SAS is something that's been around for quite a while and still quite popular. But a key thing there is that the code is really a record of the processing done that you've done, and you can read your raw data, process it, and you can generate a new set of parameters, new variables that can then be plotted using these software, and you have the record of how you did that. And you've not changed your raw data, so you could redo this with a slightly different approach, maybe add some processing to that. And so it's just a nice way of keeping a good record and enabling easy use into the future, where you don't have to think, well, how did I do that processing? Good way to preserve information. The next best practice is to perform basic quality assurance, and there's a bunch of ways of doing that. When you're doing tabular data, you can just take a glance at your data to see that the data are all delimited by commas typically, and they all line up in the proper columns. You could check about missing values. You could also scan for impossible values, maybe water temperatures that are -10 or +75, really anomalous values that you'd never see. You could look at graphs, maybe a time series, maybe a statistical summary of range and median to just check on the basic quality of the information. But to be honest, there's really no better quality assurance than to go in and begin the analysis of your data. And if there are issues like these anomalous values or issues with other issues with the data, you'll see those right away. This is an example of quality assurance from a project that I'm on with the North American Carbon Program. And this is looking at observations made at Harvard Forest in Massachusetts and comparing those observations against modeled values. And the way this works is they're looking at net ecosystem exchange. And the units are a little bit funny, so let me explain. As you near dawn here, in at 6 to 8 in the morning, CO2 goes from the atmosphere into the forest, and so that's a flux out of the atmosphere, so it's negative. And then it peaks at noon and then declines during the afternoon, and photosynthesis is shut off at sunset when the sun goes down, clearly. So that's the main message from this is we're looking at those features. But what's going on here? Anybody have an idea what's going on with this particular? It looks like photosynthesis is taking place at night. Maybe might be a Nobel Prize in that. Not sure what's going on there. Well, it turns out that some of you have already guessed that that particular model, Model X, the red model, uses UTC time, and all the others use Eastern time. So there's about a 4-hour offset, and that's causing that odd peak. So if you go in and correct for that, convert that from UTC to Eastern time, you can see the general agreement with the photosynthesis. But this is one way of examining this, where you go in and you plot all your data, and boom, you see an issue with one of them, and you can go in and correct it. So the next person doesn't have to discover that and make that correction. This next best practice is to provide documentation and metadata. These are like the questions that we had asked when I first was introducing metadata. And this is really an outline of the documentation that we expect you to be generating as you prepare your data for archival. What does the data set describe? Why was the data set created? Who did the work? When, where, how was each parameter measured? How reliable are the data? This is just basic information that will help somebody come in and understand what it is you've done. An important aspect of data management is to protect your data. I'm sure you've all known about people who have had a hard drive burn up or have received the blue screen of death, that blue screen in the lower right, and realize that everything on their computer that they worked on for the past couple of years has been lost. It's a pretty sickening feeling. So we recommend that you create backup copies and recommend that you make 3 copies, important. One is the original, one is an on-site backup, and one is an off-site backup. And the off-site backup is really to ensure that if something were to happen to your building, say a hurricane were to come or a fire were to occur, something, a real tragedy, that you'd have that backup copy somewhere else. Your work is real valuable and you need that. How often should you make backups? Well, it really depends upon the kind of data you're collecting. If you're collecting, say, flux tower data every 30 minutes, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, you might want to make backups daily, weekly, and monthly, something like that. If you're only doing seasonal work, and say you make a trip out to Yellowstone or something, and you study that particular system. When you come back, you make a backup copy of your files, and you might not make another backup for a while because you're not adding new data to it. Obviously, while you're in the field, you want to make sure you have backups of it. An important aspect of this, too, is that you know that you can recover from a data loss. If you do have a data loss, there's another sickening feeling when you go to the backup and you realize that there's nothing there, or you cannot pull the information off of it. So you want to, every year or so, you want to go in and just say, okay, today's the day. I'm going to go in and see if I can pull files off of my backup and make sure that they're readable and they're complete. Another aspect of protecting your data is to ensure that when you give your data to someone else, particularly large data files, and people can generate huge data files from sensors and model output, et cetera, is to do something we call generate a checksum, both before and after the transfer. And a checksum is really a numerical value that's based on the number of bits in the file. So if I'm going to send you a file, I run one of these checksum programs that are listed at the bottom of the slide, and I get a checksum value, and I send you the file, and I send you that checksum. When you receive the file, you repeat that particular method for generating a checksum, and you should get the same value. If you don't, you know that the file's been corrupted someplace along the way, and you need to go and investigate. The last best practice is really dealing with archival, and that is to preserve your data. And it's something that you need to be thinking about from the start. What kind of information do I need to compile to preserve the data over the long term? We suggest that you follow these 10 best practices for sure. Well-structured data files with well-defined variable names, units, and the values well-defined. Good documentation and metadata associated with the files, and then really some additional information over the long term. If you have a website or a wiki for your project where you've been contributing things like protocols and other information about your study that might be useful in the long term, package that up and make it a companion to the document for the data set. And then, of course, you also want to let the archives know about any publications that resulted from your work so that they can see how you used your data in a scientific publication. So these are the best practices. I think you'll have to agree that there's nothing really earth-shattering here. There's some habits that we think you should follow that will really make your data more useful for yourself and also for others. So when your project is over, where should the data be archived? I want to leave you with a couple thoughts about that. I mentioned that you really need to start thinking about that at the beginning of the project as part of your project planning. Really what you should do for a large NSF or NASA kinds of projects, you should contact the data center early to find out what they require, and so that then you could start hitting that set of requirements during the course of your study, so you could just pass it off to them. And really it's important to know what they require. I have a couple of data centers, archives listed here, of course, the ORNL DAAC, where we work, Suresh and I work, and Yashing, who's speaking later. But there's other data centers out there, and what you need to do is look where your discipline, where your domain archives their data, and contact them to see about their requirements and whether it be a suitable place to deposit your data. So in conclusion, data management is important in today's science. I think we can all appreciate that with the advent of sensors that can compile lots of information, computers that can process that, and storage devices that can store it, that it's really important to manage your data so you just don't have a hoarder's mess of data with files and things that you can't sort through and find. So well-organized data would really enable researchers to work more effectively, both by themselves and also with collaborators. And I think it's important to expect that your data can potentially be reused in ways not imagined when you originally collected it. And that's the important thing here, is that there's some big questions out there that require lots of data from lots of different perspectives, and the data you compile could go into helping to address those. Every day you need to include data management in your research workflow, and it should really be a habit in your everyday work practices. I have some web resources here, the workshops that we've given over the past few years at Ecological Society of America and some NASA meetings. We also have this webinar is up on that workshop site, so you can see these PowerPoint presentations. And then this bottom bullet is our ORNL DAAC guidance on data management. And it's really a kind of a long document, but it has a lot of good advice about how to handle both tabular and spatial data. Here's some references, and then I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer, to talk about the Encore.
Sure. Thank you, Bob. Few of the users have noted that the first workshop link is not working that you listed on your previous slide, so we can maybe address that later. For those of you who are going to be participating in part 2, which is focused on geospatial data best practices, after we complete, go through the next few the polling questions, I'll put up the contact information, also, move to the question and answer period for part 1. You'll need to log off and log in with the specific login URL for part 2, so that, we don't have, the issue where people who are registered for part 2 cannot attend because there's people from part 1 who are not registered in the room, and keep both of the webinars separate and the recordings available to all of you, okay? And I'll do another reminder in a few minutes. So I want to move to the contact information slide real quick here for you. This will all be available as well. I will post all this information, so don't worry if you don't catch the information right now. You've got the speaker information. Always feel free to email any of us with any general questions or specific questions related to this particular webinar. And then we're going to move directly now to the polling questions, okay? If you could take a minute or two to fill these out, that would be fantastic. Again, there's no submit button, so what you'll do is once you select your answer, know that it has been registered. Okay, I'm going to give it a minute or two, and then we'll move directly to the question and answer period for part 1. Thank you. Also, if you're interested in the Q&A portion where we will address the questions, be sure to stay on the line and or in the meeting room. Thank you. Okay, everybody, I'm not seeing very much movement, so why don't we go ahead and move on to the question and answer period. And I thank you all for joining us today, by the way. Really appreciate it. It's great to have you here. As you can see in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, I've got the presentation in PowerPoint format along with the final agenda and the contact information slide that are posted. I will also post the presentation at the tinyurl.com/earthdatawebinar in PDF format as well as PowerPoint, okay, and that will be done in the next day or so. So why don't we go ahead and jump to the questions here. Again, we will be taking them, okay, let's see, first of all, not working, here's the correct link. Okay, questions, you go ahead and type them into the Q&A pod at the top of the screen here. We'll go ahead and take those questions. Any questions? I'm not seeing any questions yet. Let's see. Okay. Somebody has to have a question here out of 60 people. Okay, here we go. Moving to the first question. I'm not sure if if this was a completed question or not, but it says, I'm guessing it means to say, what is your rule for names of files? If that's not correct, the end user, that is JORIGEL@tnc.org, please correct me. That'd be great. Okay, Bob or Suresh?
So the rule for names of files, I think that the key thing about naming your files is that they be descriptive. And how you do that exactly is kind of up to you. I gave an example of the Bigfoot project that had information about the project, the site, the parameter that was measured in the year, as well as the file format, and that's the kind of information that's really good to have within a file. The example was just that, an example. If you can think of a better way of compiling that kind of information in there, that's good. I think the other thing to remember is you don't want to have it be too long. You want to have it a reasonable size. Some programs, some directory structure systems have limitations, and so something on the order of maybe 20 to 30 characters is what you want to shoot for.
So just to follow up, the user had asked about the limit with the 236 characters. So like Bob mentioned, what we want is not a full description about the data set within the file name, but something that basically characterizes the content. So having the spatial extent, the parameter, and the temporal information, but to stick within about 30 to 40 characters or so at the most.
Okay, thank you, Suresh. The next question is, what is the role of programming languages on data management practices?
So I think the one key role, and I think that Suresh and Yashing, who's here in the room, might amplify this, but one key role is that it really does provide a record of what you've done, and it allows you to 6 months later come in and maybe change that if say a reviewer questions a statistical analysis or wants a different figure, a different organization for your figure, you can just go back in and tweak the code and redo it. I think that the code is very important from a history standpoint, so you know exactly the steps that were done to take your raw data and make them the final data that you analyze.
Okay, great. The next question. For those of you who are trying to log in already to part 2, Just as a reminder, we're still completing the Q&A portion for part one. I know they're back-to-back, so it makes it a little bit tricky, but when we have finished our questions here, you will be logged out of the room and will need to log in using the specific URL for part two. We're using the same meeting room, but you will be disconnected and will have to log back in so I can, have separate metrics and so forth for both and recordings for both webinars. Okay, so I'm sorry for that slight inconvenience, but if you've logged in early, you'll need to log back in when we're finished here. All right, the next question is, okay, that one was addressed, so the 236 character rule. There's another question here, Bob or Suresh. Could you go back to the 20-year rule and what the challenge is with that again?
The challenge is that a lot of people don't generate documentation, or if the documentation is written, it's really written for them for that week. And so it's really good for them for short term. But what we found is that a lot of the details get forgotten over a year or 2 years as you move on to other activities, maybe change jobs, change responsibilities, and so you forget a lot of the details. And so if you think out with that broad horizon, that distant horizon, and write really complete metadata, then you don't have to worry about losing information about the data over the intervening 20 years. So that's really the big challenge. And we want to make sure that everything you know about the data today, when you generate the data, is captured. Because for sure, in a week, a month, a year, 5 years, you're going to forget it, and that information is going to be lost.
Okay, great. Moving to the next question. Is ecological metadata language the standard, or are there some other alternatives?
There's some people who use EML, ecological metadata language, and that's fine. It's a fairly comprehensive metadata language. There's some international standards bodies that are developing broader standards that are more applicable across a broader range of activities. And so that is ISO 19115 as an example. There's some additional ISO metadata standards related to that, but we recommend that you follow those broader international standards. I believe that EML folks are actually modifying their metadata language to accommodate the ISO requirements.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bob. The next question is, I'm wondering how about the secondary information. For example, a process precipitation from raw data provided by NASA. Can it be archived by the data provider as well?
So that's a great question. And I like to think of it this way. If a user can get the data from NASA 5 years from now in the form that is used by the study, they want to get that precip data, and they can go to NASA and get it. I don't think there's any reason for the investigator to archive that data. But if the investigator has obtained the precip data and done some value-added processing to it, changed it in some way, made it part of their database that's very convenient, that would take a future user quite a while to put it into that format to make the analysis, then I think it's worth saving. I also think it's important that you give credit to NASA, in this case, for providing that raw precip data so that somebody knows, well, I got where you got that raw precip data, so that if they wanted to go back in there and retrace your steps, they could. And also you want to give credit to the people who generated that information. So it's a little bit of a, in some cases, yes, I think you probably want to archive that data.
Okay, fantastic. The next question is, in working with the data, I have it currently stored all in an Excel file with several worksheets related to different measurement parameters, but all at the same site locations. It has been complicated to move between these. Do you suggest another way to manage this data? So it is currently stored in an Excel file with several worksheets related to different measurement parameters, but all at the same site locations. And this user would like to know whether you suggest another way to manage these data?
So I think if it's the same parameters, what I'd end up doing is concatenating each of the worksheets into one, and then you could do an analysis more directly. That the best practice about saving your data in stable file formats, we don't recommend Excel file formats as a stable file format. We're just not convinced that those will be, the version that you're using today will be readable 20 years from now, and so that's the main reason for that. The other thing is that we have some real troubles with the multiple sheets, worksheets within one file, and how to deal with those, how to export them as CSVs. And so we recommend just not using that kind of format, because it really does complicate things, as you found out. So I think concatenating all that information would be the best way to go.
Okay, great. The next question is, if you work in collaboration and your colleagues have access to the data, what would be a way to ensure that data is not deleted by mistake or moved? Is there any software to control what each user can do?
So I think having read-only FTP access is one way. You can have local area networks that have similar read-only restrictions that you can place on the data. I think that's one way, and I think Suresh has probably some implementation of that.
Well, I mean, I think the backups are really going to help you with that sort of a situation. If this is going to be, Bob mentioned in the examples of backup that if your data is being collected at a high temporal resolution, then you may want to have more frequent backups. But another situation is if your data gets updated more frequently, maybe by multiple team members, you may want to consider doing more frequent backups. You know, at times it's difficult because you need to have read and write privileges to all members of the team for collaborative research. So I think one way to ensure that you've not lost a great deal of data is to make sure that you have more regular and timely backups. Yeah, and Yashing has more.
I just want to add one more thing here. This is not popular in the data management community, but like tools like Subversion, Git have been popularly used in source code control, and people who are doing data management started exploring using those tools like Subversion, GitHub to coordinate the data management across multiple participants in the project. You can try that, especially you have some data files that's not too huge in size. So consider those tools that's used for source code version control.
Okay, the next question is, how do you compile data collected in lab incubation experiments at multiple experimental conditions? Would you advise having separate files for each type of measurement, or separate files for each for each time point for all experimental conditions?
I'm thinking that the former would be best, is to have a file for each of the individual experimental conditions. And the one hesitation I have is that if you have, say, conditions that are common among a bunch of different experiments, say radiation and temperature and water temperature, air temperature and water temperature conditions, for example, maybe you might want to combine those experimental treatments into one file and separate it and have time and individual site, individual treatment as a variable within your file, so that you can keep track of all that. You want to minimize your work, right? You don't want to have to repeat common things like the radiation from the sun, air temperature, water temperature, other common variables if they are similar for all the different experimental treatments.
Okay, we may or may not get to the remainder of the questions here for part one because we do need to be prepared for the second webinar, which starts at 3. So if that's the case, these questions have all been registered and either of the speakers, Bob, Suresh, or Yashin, will respond to you individually, or they can, type in the answers to these questions so that they're captured within the Q&A. Okay, so not to worry. They will be answered if they're not in the next few minutes. Okay, because I see we've got quite a few. If you have several runs of the same analysis, some of them with different parameters, okay, if you have several runs of the same analysis, some of them with different parameters, but at the end not useful but maybe interesting, do you delete them or do you keep them?
Well, I don't like to throw anything away. So I would keep them, but I would make sure that they're well documented so you know what they are. And you might note that put a comment field in there that they weren't used in analysis this time. If you keep that record and why they weren't of interest this time, maybe they might be of interest in 2 years if you're continuing down that line of science and you come across a new finding or something, they might be of interest for that. So also computer space is small, is very cheap, it's large, and so keeping files is not that difficult. But you need to have a good knowledge of what each of those files contains, because if you can't find them in the future, then they're not going to be that useful for you.
Okay, next question. More than my other question, are there templates for data recording projects in certain fields of science?
The best way of thinking about that is to look at data centers for your discipline and to see how those data centers hold data. Look for data similar to your study, the parameters you're measuring, and see how they're doing it, and maybe use that as a template. We don't really have any standard ways. I'm involved in a project called FluxNet, and we've been going for 20 years now, and so we have a really good idea of how to do those files, and there's some pretty well accepted ways, and so people have gravitated towards those. But I think if you have a new field and you're looking at respiration or some other field of science, you might want to go in and see how those disciplines handle their data and then use those as data files as templates.
Okay, great. We probably only have time for 2 or 3 more. Could you talk about using ontologies?
I don't know a whole lot about ontologies, but the main thing is that it's difficult to create a very comprehensive ontology. We have a couple of places. We go to this thing called the suite ontology mapping, and there's a couple of agencies which have taken some effort to create elaborate mappings of ontologies for specific science domain. We are looking at the use of ontologies when it comes to data discovery, to be able to kind of map from one data set to another. But it's a growing research area, so that's where we stand right now.
Alistair, I think that's one where we may want to get back to you later. We can send you some ideas and some papers. And I think it's important to recognize that this is a very beginning level introduction to data management, and there's much more to learn. And I think we've just scratched the surface, as you can tell from the kinds of questions we're getting right now.
Okay, well, I think we have time for 2 more questions. One is, what computer language do you recommend?
So for processing data, I think we're gravitating towards things like R. I think a lot of people know R. There are a lot of libraries of both statistical packages and visualization packages. R also has some the ability to handle parallel computing, so it can be run on supercomputing. So that's one. I think Python is another a scripted language that is useful, and that's probably a little bit more advanced. MATLAB is certainly one that's very popular. There's a lot of libraries out for that as well.
Okay, and then one more question, and then I'm going to, I won't disconnect the telephone line, but I will be logging everybody out of part 1 so we can begin fresh for part 2, and I can save the questions specific to part 1 as a file so we can address those that did not get addressed. Okay, I hope that's okay with everybody. All right, the next, excuse me. In general, to what extent is it good to archive intermediate data? That's the last question for part 1 for today.
So I think you should contemplate archiving for sure the final data from your study, and perhaps the raw data, the initial data that you generated, and then also archive the code that converted that raw data to intermediate to final data. I think that sort of a sequence would be very effective, and that way that you have a record of what you did. If there's any question in the future, that code could be used to address that.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for participating in the encore presentation for part 1. We're going to, I'll stay on the phone line, but I'm going to go ahead and log off from part 1, okay? So if you've logged in early for part 2, I'm sorry for the...
The conference is now in talk mode.
If you've logged in for part 2, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I'll want you to log back in a minute or two, okay? This way we can keep, the questions and answers and polls and so forth separate, and that'll be to, everyone's advantage when we post the recordings and the presentations. Thank you so much, everybody. Okay. Bye-bye. Some of you could stay on the line, but for those logging off their computer, thanks again.